Well, hello again, and welcome to another Retropower Uncut. I'm going to try and make this one reasonably quick. We're actually off to Retro Rides Weekender at Goodwood tomorrow. So it feels like an absolutely manic day trying to tie up all the loose ends before we go. But if you follow me over here, Utah, I think last week we were filling fluid. So we got the coolant in there, we've got the oil in there, Trev doing his danger pour with no funnel. I think since then we've now got all the throttle bodies on, finished the fuel plumbing, so we're ready to stick some fuel in this now and purge the system on that. The main thing really in the way of starting it now is just finishing off some wiring. So if you remember, Max at Bremax has done all of the main loom on it. It's running two ECU master PDUs which control all the electrics and a DTA S60 engine ECU. We're really just now got to do all of the sort of sub-looms, as I call it. So Max will have terminated everything to a multi-plug for things like the instruments, the switch panels, but then the actual little small looms that go onto those, so the switch panel for instance has a load of little rotary switches on it, there'll be a little sub-loom that goes from those switches to the mating half of those multi-plugs. We've got to do those, which is what we're going to be on with next week, and then that will be the final piece of the puzzle really on being able to start it up. And then there's going to be a lot of things coming together very quickly on it. We were sort of going over jobs with it the other day, and it's kind of in that state where it looks relatively unfinished, but once we've got the hydrodip parts back, the chrome parts back, and the interior parts back, it's all pretty much just ready to go in, apart from doing those wiring sublooms. So happy with that. Kaiser is going to be handed over later today, so I guess next week that will no longer be in the workshop. Really happy with that, absolutely. Just a stunning car. I mean, it's a beautiful car anyway, but I think we'll have to come back and do a feature specifically about that car at some point. The Golf, Dean has taken the seats. We're doing a retrim on the interior, which is one of the remaining jobs on this. It's having the standard Golf seats, but they're being retrimmed with Mark 6 GTD central centre panels, so it's like a grey tartan pattern and a plain fabric on the sides. Again, just in keeping with this kind of knocked back, toned down look with that car. The Manta, we've been doing a fair bit on this actually over the last couple of weeks. We've got the fuel system pretty much buttoned up. It's on a carb. I mean, this is a very old school build for us in terms of the kind of approach to it. Rover V8, you know, Manta, running a carb. But there's something quite nice about the simplicity of all of that. And that extends to things like the fuel system, where it's, you know, it's just basically just a single mechanical pump. We're running a Holly pump on it. Good old-fashioned filter king, filter regulator unit, single fuel line to the carb, and that's basically it. So we're sort of able to just focus on doing a really tidy job of everything. So we've done a really nice, like, polished stainless steel mount in the boot that's on anti-vibration mounts that mounts the pump and the filter king. We're then running braided lines from there up to the front. We've refurbed the fuel tank, got that in, and we've now moved on to the exhaust. So previously, a few weeks back, Clive had started on doing the front section. It's running flipped P38 manifolds that both point forward. We've got a cross pipe coming across from the driver's side to the passenger side. Passenger side loops round and back on it, 2-into-1 collector just above the steering rack, and then James is now taking over and doing the rest of the system. Relatively straightforward system, single box at the back, wants to be fairly leery. We're going to have an oval tailpipe on it. The only bit we've still not even got installed at all yet is that we're going to do an exhaust divert valve. So you've got a side pipe coming out which you can switch a valve basically to open up for maximum noise offensiveness at the traffic lights. So we're just trying to sort a decent quality sort of slimline valve. I think we're going to go with a QTP one. Just getting one of those ordered up at the minute. And that will get the exhaust system finished. And at that point, you know, with fuel system done, exhaust system done, we've got to do the cooling system and the oil system, but we're kind of edging towards being able to fire this. It's one of those where you forget on a carburetor engine, of course there's nothing really involved electrically. You can just put a battery pretty much to the distributor and fire it up. It's a lot simpler than some of the things we're working on. A good example of which is the Stratos, which is probably one of the more complicated projects. Now this is going to Northampton Motorsport next week for its mapping session and general electronic setup on it. We've already had it fired up and running. Generally happy with everything on it in terms of how it runs. I'm hoping to take this a little trundle around the yard later today and we've been working forward to having everything in place to allow that to happen. So we needed to get the display screen in there properly. We obviously got the parts back from anodizing that mount that, and I took over on the column shroud the other day and did a little bit of finishing work on that. It's basically a 3D printed extension on the top to make what was a very short Fiat X19 shroud mate up with our dash that's a lot further back than the Fiat dash. So it's two parts mated up there, a little bit of fiddling and fettling to get that to fit in there nicely. That now needs to come off and be upholstered or flocked, but happy with the fit. We needed to get the transmission tunnel, I was going to say, but of course it's not got it's just got the gear linkage in it. We previously made this and all the panels that are on there. So there's an anodized aluminium panel at the front there that's got the heat control, it's got the battery isolated controls, and it's also got two potentiometers which can be assigned to basically any function on the ECU or even on the PDU, but the plan there is to assign those to traction control functions. I've got wheel speed sensors all around on this, so we'll be able to have two different user selectable criteria, if you like, on the traction control. So probably allowable amount of slip and aggression of cut is a likely choice, or we could assign one of them to a launch control if we wanted, so the amount of revs that is allowed with launch control active. It's a possibility. So we wanted to get that in there so everything was mounted and not just lying on the floor in terms of the wiring. Dean's been doing the carpets. They are pretty much ready to go in, I believe, actually. I just haven't bothered at the minute because we're still working on it. There's no point in getting the carpets all scuffed up. We've obviously got the driver's seat in here, so we can tootle it around, and Troy's got somewhere to sit when he's mapping it at Northampton. We're going to get the steering wheel on. We've also got the back window in, which was an absolute pain. If anybody, all the mini guys will probably feel this pain. It's the type of glass where the glass is smaller than the aperture and the seal basically goes edge to edge rather than the overlap type seal. And they're generally easier to fit the seal to the aperture and then pull the glass into the seal rather than normally the other type of seal. You'd put the seal on the glass. But they're such a pain, especially on a really small window like that with tight corners. So that was a bit of a challenging job. It's always the unlikely jobs that are challenging. But yeah, we're getting there basically to a state where we can get this rolling road in. All the functions work, brake, clutch, gears. Happy with all of that stuff. So fingers crossed for next week. Right, follow me. You'll see as we go through here, there's probably looks a bit different to the people who are used to seeing the row of shelving in here. We're doing various improvements in the workshop at the moment. One of the things that's involved is totally revamping the air system. So we're moving the compressor into that room and installing completely new air mains throughout the building. So we're going to touch on the Landcruiser, which I can't remember if we'd started at all last week. I don't think we had. So I tell you what, if you come around here, Jamie, we got to the immediately exciting bit. It's always fun, when you're doing an engine swap, just dangling the engine in there and seeing how it looks and hoping it fitted how you envisaged it would. And that went really well. We were always quite nervous about the rear prop length on this and how far forward that would mean having the engine, and it's sat exactly how we wanted it to go. So to recap, it's an early non-VVT Toyota 1UZ V8. We've mated that up to an 80 series Landcruiser transmission, the early one, which was fully mechanical. Because we're trying to keep things really simple on this, so the gearbox has no electronic control at all. It has a kick-down cable, it has a mechanically selected shift, and everything is mechanical within it, so there's no ECU for the transmission. And we've hoisted that in there and it sits absolutely perfect in there. Rear prop length is fine, if anything more than I thought it would be. So Stu's taken over on that. He's fabricating the engine mounts. He's about done on that. We've made some nut plates. On these, everything on the chassis is riveted, and they do that intentionally. Welding to chassis legs like this is potentially an area where you could instigate cracks. Nissan Navara owners would know all about that. So everything's riveted, and we wanted to continue that, not welding to the chassis legs theme, but rather than using old-fashioned sort of hammered-on rivets like they did on this, we're using bolts on the engine mounts. And to allow us to do that, we're basically making captive nut plates which slip inside the chassis leg and then they're retained inside the chassis leg, and then the engine mount bolts through from the outside. So he's about done on the engine mounts. He's just moving on to the, he's actually under there now, he's just doing the transmission mount. Everything sits pretty well. We've had to ease a little bit of floor out of the way, just on this side where the transfer box sticks out, but nothing too dramatic. Not a great shot really with the foam mat on there, but it's all gone pretty well. And then Scott has been on with preparing the dash for trial fitment of the heating and aircon unit that we're going to use. So it's an interesting construction. On the near side of the dash, the glove box structure is actually all a welded in piece, and when you look underneath from normal, it looks like the bulkhead is much lower than it is, but it's actually the fabricated underside of the glove box. So we've taken all of that out. We've obviously taken everything else off the dash so it's out of the way, and we are looking at which vintage air heater aircon unit we can get in there, and I'd like to use the Gen 4 unit, I think it is. I can't remember if it's Gen 4 or Gen 5, but basically the big one that has the flapper valve between hot and cold, because it's just got a nicer control layout. It's rather than constantly drawing air through the aircon and the heater matrix, and just going hot and cold by virtue of turning the compressor off and opening and shutting the water valve, it actually has a flapper which chooses the airflow between the two, which just means the temperature control is much quicker. So I'd like to do that, and I think it will fit. We've had a little mock-up of the unit in there. I think we're going to ease the bulkhead forward a bit in the middle. There's a recess that normally the engine sits into, which this one doesn't, which means we can bring that forward a bit. And then the plan is to actually use the original heater blower, or at least the casing with a modern motor in it, because it's really nicely located in the engine bay. It intakes through what would be this on the other side, and then feeds the air straight in through the bulkhead. So I think what we're going to do is get a vintage air unit, take the fan unit off it, make a 3D printed manifold that mates it up to that original intake on the bulkhead, and then use the original blower assembly in there, which keeps the blower in the engine bay, which is just keeps a bit more space behind the dash, and it's a great way of locating it over there with the louvered intake. So yeah, it's progressing nicely. It's obviously slightly unusual the way we're approaching this one. Normally you see us just strip everything to bare metal straight away, but with this, because so much of the body is staying standard, it made sense to kind of get straight into the dry build side of things with it all completely built still, especially as obviously when we separate the body and chassis, it essentially becomes two cars we've got to find storage for as well. So we're going to do most of the build on this with it assembled still like this, and then once we've done all the metal work like this, then strip it down and blast it all. So that's that one. Jensen. Where were we last week? So we were gearing up for the owner visiting and doing a trial seating in it, which he did. It was he really enjoyed the visit. Great opportunity to kind of see the progress on the car, and sitting in it and sort of feeling the controls was always a little glimpse of the future. Generally happy. It was well worth the visit though, because we did need to make a couple of changes. We've changed the angle of the steering column up slightly. We've also moved the seat inboard slightly, because it's quite wide across the shoulder, which none of us had really anticipated, and it was going to be very tight. It was pretty much going to be shoulder against the door glass. So we've moved the seat inboard an amount, I forget now, it might be somewhere between 1 and 2 inches, I think, and up slightly. And yeah, with those changes done, really happy with that. Rich was doing the tail end of the bulkhead fiberglass work to mate up the body with our modified steel bulkhead there, which is finished. He then obviously spent a fair bit of time getting the bonnet on and correctly aligned to make sure the fit between the scuttle and the bonnet was looking as it should, and that's all looking great. As we found sort of early on in the build as well, bonnet clearance on the Supercharger on the LSA is good. It's almost like they intended it to have that in there. So we're now moving on to the rear valance modifications. We talked previously about the fact we're trying to pull this all in slightly and revise the curvature of that rear valance, mainly because we're not running a rear bumper, to try and clean up the look of the back, and without the rear bumper breaking that area up, this starts to look really quite a slabby face as standard, and it does even with the bumper. So Tom's taking charge on that. He's just laying out a sort of wire skeleton frame under here at the minute, so you can get a really good vision at the moment of how that's going to look. And the plan is then to fabricate that in steel or aluminium. You're doing this in steel or alley? Steel, yeah. So we're going to fabricate that lower section in steel. If you recall from previously, we're actually using this body essentially as a book to then take a mould from to make a new body, rather than using a sort of patchwork of old 1960s fiberglass repairs over the years and additions. So that valance we're actually going to make in steel, because obviously we can pull a mould from that as easily as we can from fiberglass, and it's going to be easier to make that shape in steel than it is to make it in fiberglass, because we'd have to create the shape in something to shape the fiberglass too anyway. So that's the plan there. I'm really looking forward to seeing that come together. The Morris is over at Simpson Race Exhausts. I got sent some pictures yesterday. They finished it. It looks absolutely amazing. Those guys just smash it out of the park every time. I can't really speak highly enough of them, to be honest. So we'll show you that next week when it's back. And I don't know whether they're working on the Chevette right now, but we got to a bit of a landmark point with the Chevette. Kind of finally got to the end of all of that polyester block sanding and got epoxy, and it's that kind of rapid snowball effect from there on. It feels like you've been climbing a huge mountain and then basically you just slide down the other side. So Gaz did, I think, three batches in the booth earlier this week, so 2 batches of panels. There's a lot of parts on it with all the body kit parts and the shell itself. So now everything's in epoxy primer. That's the final coat before we wet sand that, ready for final paint. So I think the next step is going to get the shell in the booth again, wrapped to the underside, and then I don't know whether we'll be painting the inside first or wet sanding the epoxy on the outside first, but certainly it's going to be reasonably rapid from now to completed paint on that. Really looking forward to seeing the first sort of final coats of paint go on. So hopefully we might see, I would guess by next week, something is going to have some final colour on it. So yeah, that's about it for now. We're going to pack up at the end of today, head down to Goodwood tomorrow, and hopefully have an awesome weekend at Retro Rides Weekender. So we'll catch you next week, probably with a hangover. See you later.